Hello! In this series of videos we're going to be having a look at events depicted in the 1984 film The Killing Fields. We're going to see how accurate they are, how it differs from the source material. I'm also going to share some visuals, some maps to give you an idea of what happened where, and we're going to basically see how accurate these scenes, the whole movie, is by the end of the series. Now, I don't think in particular for what we're covering in this video, the fall of Phnom Penh, that anyone has actually sort of put the places on a map and said when happened and what happened where. So I think that's a first, at least for YouTube. So stick around. Now, if you haven't seen the movie, it's easily the most famous film ever made about Cambodia. It follows the story written by Schanberg, a New York Times correspondent who covered the Cambodian Civil War and its immediate aftermath. Now, in the movie, it basically follows Schanberg and his Khmer assistant Dith Pran as they investigate things like the 1973 American bombing campaign. The movie then sort of comes back to them covering the fall of Phnom Penh and its immediate aftermath. And then the movie goes further to show what happens to Dith Pran when he goes through his struggles of survival during the Pol Pot regime. And it shows Sydney's sort of guilt and remorse at having left his friend behind in Cambodia to an unknown fate. In this video, we're only going to be covering the events of one day, the 17th of April, 1975, the fall of Phnom Penh. Now, if you need some historical background there, basically the Lon Nol regime was on its last legs. The communists controlled the vast majority of the countryside and they'd been besieging the capital city, Phnom Penh, for several months at this point. They eventually overrun the defenses, the Republican army retreats, surrenders, and from all directions, the Khmer Rouge army, sort of in a pincer movement, captures the city. Now, in the morning, a very jubilant atmosphere of celebration that the war was over is suddenly interrupted by the Khmer Rouge calling for the entire city and all of its inhabitants to evacuate. That's more than 2 million people. It's a shock to the people that had to experience it, as well as to those looking on, including the journalists who will follow through the events of that day. Eventually, the evacuation will kill more than 20,000 people over the course of the next few weeks and months. And it's an infamous symbol of the beginning of this murderous, indeed genocidal regime. So we're going to just be looking at what happens on the 17th of April from morning until evening. And we're going to be using multiple sources, including The Life and Death of Dith Pran, the book that Schanberg wrote about his experiences. We've also got various interviews with people who were there, like Rockoff, and we have other memoirs and journals that people wrote about the experience as well. So we're going to start with the morning of the 17th and we'll go from there. So we know from a few different sources that Schanberg was back at his hotel quite early in the morning after his attempts to keep sending out copy were interrupted because basically the telegram office was closed. Now, he says that he is back at his hotel after having seen basically the civil war very close to the edges of the city. Basically, you can see the smoke and the fires, so he knows how close it is. He knows that today is the day. He goes back to his hotel and he showers and shaves, and he said that that was at around about 6:30 in the morning. So we can basically give the movie a timestamp at this point, and we can follow the rest of the day from here. Now, within the hour, the Khmer Rouge armed forces begin coming into Phnom Penh from, as I said before, from all different directions surrounding the city. The majority of the Lon Nol soldiers by this point, as I said, they've surrendered, they've ditched their uniforms, they've gone home basically to try and find safety. Now, the depiction of the trucks and military vehicles coming down the road here, the white blankets, everything else white that people were putting out of their windows, basically to contribute in this way, this jubilant sort of parade-like atmosphere. This is all spot on visually, and we can say that this is probably occurring around about 9 a.m. Now, in a departure from what is shown here, and thinking that this peaceful atmosphere might continue, Schanberg and Pran actually head back to the cable office to see if they can write anything, see if they can send it back to America. They find that it's still closed. In and around that area, though, they do speak to their first Khmer Rouge soldier, and Sydney says that this occurred at around about 10:30 in the morning. So again, we have another timestamp for the day. Afterwards, they walk back to their hotel, Le Phnom. This is shown in the movie to look like this, but it actually looks like this. And for those interested, the hotel had been known before the 1970 coup as Le Royal, but because it was getting rid of the royals in the coup, they also changed the name of this famous hotel to Le Phnom. That being said, it is now known as Le Royal again, and it looks like this. It's located here in the northern part of the city, sort of near Wat Phnom, and this whole kind of area, particularly the hotel, this will be a base for where most of the things happen that day to the journalists. Meanwhile, in the same time frame of the morning, Al Rockoff, played by John Malkovich in the movie, he's been exploring the outskirts of Phnom Penh. He's seen the real Khmer Rouge as opposed to these ones that are coming in this parade-like atmosphere, which, as they say in the movie, don't seem quite right. He's been in the southern parts of the city as well, around the Independence Monument, and he's actually been hitching rides around with soldiers to get from A to B. Eventually, he begins walking up Monivong Boulevard here, and he waves down a white Peugeot, and it's driven by a Cambodian who was wearing hospital scrubs. He remembered the driver being visibly anxious when Rockoff told him that he was American. He can't speak French, and he said, "Yeah, I'm American." The driver sort of freaks out a little bit, and the doctor tells him that he has just been at the Prayer Ket Malia Hospital. Now, that's a large military hospital. It also does see civilians as well. It's still in Phnom Penh today. It's here. And he actually says that the patients there are being forced out onto the streets. Now, after this, Rockoff is dropped off at Le Phnom. He goes into the hotel, he sees Pran, he tells him what he's been doing that morning, he tells him what he's thinking about doing next. There they also meet Schanberg, they discuss everything, and with John Swain as well, played by the late Julian Sands, they decide at that point to drive to the hospital, and from Swain's memoir, we can say that they get to the hospital at 12 o'clock. So far the film has remained fairly spot on with its depictions. It's mixed a few things together, like having Rockoff sort of arrive on the APC during the parade rather than on in a white Peugeot, and he doesn't see them in the hotel, he's seeing them on the street. But another thing is that it's Sydney, seemingly out of nowhere, that suggests they go to the hospital, as opposed to Rockoff explaining that he's heard about it and that they should go there.
I don't know, I don't like the look of this. I took a swing through Keng Keng this morning, practically got my ass shot off. I'm gonna go to the hospital. You wanna come with me?
It does neatly introduce the idea that the Khmer Rouge they were seeing were not quite right. It turns out that they were not really part of the main force of the Khmer Rouge. They were sort of imposters. which is, it's handy for the movie to express that, and it does it sort of visually and with just a couple of lines of dialogue. So what this does, it sort of sets the audience up, as well as, the inhabitants of Phnom Penh, for this, surprise that is soon to occur. They're going to be blindsided by what happens, and it also neatly gets us to the next destination in the movie, to the hospital. All in all, pretty close to the story so far. So as we said, we can say that this hospital scene begins at 12 o'clock. The journalists did explore the hospital. They witnessed perhaps more than 1,000 wounded people stuck at this location, and they also saw Khmer Rouge being treated as well. The film's graphic depiction of the amount of blood, it being mopped up, was remembered by everyone who was present. For instance, Rockoff recalled that there were bodies everywhere, there was blood everywhere, that it was easy to slip over in the blood, it was still very wet. But in reality, it was much worse than what we even see on screen. Schanberg wrote that the nurses were actually mopping around dead bodies, and there was very close by a Khmer Rouge soldier that had severe head and stomach wounds, who was whispering over and over again that he needed water. Now, there are some conflicting accounts about the number of doctors that were there that day. However, what they all agree on is that none of them have this interaction with an English-speaking doctor who's operating on a child. This was probably an amalgamation of what had been witnessed at a makeshift Red Cross hospital that was set up at Le Phnom, and the Western doctors there that were still treating people as the Civil War drew to a close. Now, Swain remembers that they left the hospital at 1 o'clock, which is where we can mark the timing of the next event. As the group leave the hospital, they're accosted by a group of Khmer Rouge, much like seen on screen. What occurs over the next few minutes is also more or less the same. The journalists, at gunpoint forced into the APC, the captured Lon Nol armoured personnel carrier. There's also a captured government soldier who is driving the APC. Pran is pleading with them to be taken along with the journalists, despite being told that, no, we're only after the big ones by the Khmer Rouge soldiers. Eventually, he did persuade them to let him come in, but one of the differences here is that, as far as I can tell from the sources, Rockoff isn't the one that says, why doesn't he get his ass in here?
Why doesn't he get his ass in here?
He's trying to get in. They won't let him in.
That exchange, whether it was said like that, but the questioning of what Dith Pran was doing was actually done by Schanberg to the driver, Sarun. Schanberg wasn't sure what Pran was doing, unaware that he was bravely deciding to join them in this extremely dangerous situation. Now, the drive to the destination provides another, few very slightly different examples of what happened that day, as well as what we see on screen. The journey itself actually was pretty short. They pick up one other prisoner who it turns out is a commanding officer in the Navy, who, he was wearing plain clothes. When he was put in, he put his wallet with his identification, sort of tried to hide that. He looked very nervous from all accounts. So then they travel here to the ruins of the Japanese Friendship Bridge. It had been destroyed in the war. Now, Schanberg thinks it takes just under an hour to get there, so an hour in the APC. Whereas Rockoff, who I think makes a bit more sense on this one, thinks it was probably more around 15 to 20 minutes, which makes sense given where they start and where they end up. Now, another scene that's shown here is Sydney grabbing this flower, again, true to life. It was given to him by his daughter, and even though he really did think that they were all going to be killed, he showed Swain the flower and said, hey, don't worry, I've got my good luck rose that my daughter gave me. We're going to be okay. Now, the group arrive at the area near the river and are directed at gunpoint to the area underneath the bridge. Now, for an hour, Pran continues to plead with the Khmer Rouge for them to let them go. Basically, he just keeps making the case that they're journalists and saying that the press, according to radio broadcasts, had still been allowed to operate that day. He keeps saying this over and over again. Now, there's actually a difference between the book that Schanberg wrote and what he explained happened here in the testimony that he provided at the Khmer Rouge tribunals in the early 2010s. Now, the book plays out much like the film, with Pran talking, and it's all very tense. And then, there's a bit of a nod, it's all going to be okay. Before a courier is sent by the Khmer Rouge, the one that seems to be in charge, this courier, you don't really know what's happening in the movie, but in the book it's made clear that this courier was to go and basically find out from some higher ups what to do with these journalists. Now, in reality, Pran actually goes with this person on the motorbike to the Ministry of Information, which is here, and he returns about half an hour later with the confirmation that the press was still allowed to operate. Then they're basically free to go. This is what Schanberg later testified to, and what all of the other memoirs and journals and accounts of these events, basically they all say the same thing. Overall, however, there are some other major differences to what happened to the journalists in this time period as what is shown on screen. Firstly, in the real events, no one is killed. They don't see any dead bodies in the boat. They don't see this person being teased with an apple on the end of a bayonet and then shot. None of that actually happened. Second, there is the timing of it all. Like the movie, as we've seen, it doesn't really give the audience an impression of the timing of some of these things, nor does it need to. But they're there for around 2 to 3 hours. Long enough that they'll actually begin to see the beginnings of the evacuation take place, which is supposed to have, like the call for that to occur, probably started around midday. So at this point, maybe it's 1, 2, maybe 3 o'clock, they actually start seeing the earliest crowds of people start to march out of the city with this evacuation order occurring. We obviously don't see that either. That's saved for the next few scenes. Now, third, overall, the journalists were treated much better in real life than what's shown in the movie. Once, there is a tense atmosphere for that first hour when Pran is pleading with them to, that they're journalists. Once he has the confirmation, however, I think once he's even gone on the motorcycle, the atmosphere is much less tense. The Khmer Rouge share water with the journalists. In fact, later, once some other Khmer Rouge who had been engaging in some sort of general looting around the city, they sort of come by and they share some, spoils of their looting, including some Pepsi. And the Khmer Rouge, it's shown in the movie that the young soldier sort of psychs out Sydney with the bottle of cola, and it's supposed to mirror, the scene where he's just killed someone the same way for taking a bite of an apple. In reality, Schanberg, he writes this down in the book, he says that he tried to psych him out, but then Schanberg said, "O kun chang," which is sort of like, "Oh, thank you very much," in Khmer, and the soldier ended up giving him the bottle. Now, you might say that these are minor changes, and you'd be right to say that, but there is obviously a much darker mood being portrayed here, and this is a choice that the screenwriter and director have made to deviate from the source material, which they had, and they also had access to the people that were there. So these changes evoke a more menacing side of the Khmer Rouge, showing what they were capable of, and it's certainly true that killings like this were occurring in places around the city. It makes sense to include it somewhere, but it simply wasn't something that the journalists saw or experienced whilst they were detained. When they do leave, they remembered seeing that the person that they had been brought with, this naval commander, he did not get to come with them, and they were certain that he was going to be killed, but again, they didn't see it. So what happened next? Well, they're actually driven to the Ministry of Information, and they leave around about 4 o'clock. They're driven here, as I said, the same place that Pran had gone to go and get confirmation that they could be freed. It's where the victorious insurgents were kind of setting up their base of operations. And it's this general area, it's actually the railway station here. This is where Pol Pot will come back into Phnom Penh and sort of oversee the earlier stages of the revolution on the 20th of April, so in 3 days' time. But this general area is where a lot of Khmer Rouge activity will occur. Now, the events at the Ministry of Information that the journalists see are not at all shown in the movie. What we miss out on is detailed in all of the journals and memoirs, and it's testified by the people that were there. So we have a very standard story about what they saw. Basically, when they arrive, they see around about 50 people that were obviously prisoners, that were sort of knelt down in front of the Ministry of Information. They also see two groups sort of conversing. One is a group of basically remnants of the Lon Nol regime, sort of officials, and the people speaking to them are, well, there's one representative, a Khmer Rouge representative, and a number of soldiers behind him. Now, when the journalists arrive, this sort of conversation ends, and actually the representative of the Khmer Rouge even has a brief conversation with the journalists in French. Very polite, apparently, basically says to Pran that maybe they should stick around and get registered, but Pran kind of senses that something's not quite right and he thinks they should get going. Pran basically had a sixth sense about a lot of these things, and he was correct. Loudspeaker and radio broadcasts have been calling for members of the Lon Nol regime, officials, soldiers, people like that, anyone connected to the old government. These broadcasts were basically saying, yep, if you're part of that, come to this area and help with this transition of power. Basically, if you did arrive there, 9 times out of 10, you were quickly arrested, and in fact, soon after, you would have been executed. Some of the top officials were killed here, close by, on the grounds of a French sports club known as the Cercle Sportif. Schanberg recalled seeing former Prime Minister Long Boré turn up while they were at the ministry, and he was one of the so-called super traitors that the Khmer Rouge had actually been announcing that they would execute since February. So for them, it's pretty... It's sort of a known quantity what is going to happen to him. Pran and Schanberg actually get to talk to him for a very brief moment. They basically wish them well, and after that, Long Beret and his wife are ushered into the building and never seen again. Rockoff recalls that after this interaction, the group of journalists were then instructed to go to the French embassy. Schanberg writes that they arrive at Le Phnom at exactly 5:20. And there they're told by a Red Cross official that the Khmer Rouge had ordered the hotel to be emptied and that they'd been given half an hour to do so. He then tells Schanberg that only 5 minutes of that half hour now remain. So they're very rushed. The group got what they could of their luggage and belongings. They pile it into an abandoned Toyota van that was left on sort of the parking area of the hotel. They put it in neutral and they begin pushing this van with their belongings up Monivong Boulevard to the French embassy. So from here up to here. Now this is where the film picks back up. So we can say that this is occurring at around about 5:30. Now, Rockoff also specifically testified that the Khmer Rouge would not allow you to drive the vehicle, but it was okay to push it. So that seems to be exactly what is being conveyed in this scene right at this moment. This is where the film takes the time to show off one of its most incredible scenes. The forced evacuation of Phnom Penh, the 2 million residents being told to go into the countryside for anywhere between 3 to 5 to 7 days. They were told that there would be American bombs incoming. They were told not to pack very much. Basically, they're sent to an unknown fate. These scenes are ingeniously shot and probably as close to the real thing that may ever be put into a movie. The director used more than 3,000 extras to achieve this level of realism, and as can be seen right just here, it was filmed on a railway track in order to sort of mimic the wide boulevards of Phnom Penh, because it was being filmed in Thailand. The crowds, the sounds, the injured being forced out on their hospital beds, limping away with these wounds, this was all reported by multiple witnesses to the events, and again, incredible realism being portrayed here. Often, these extras shown with sort of missing limbs were actually victims of the Civil War or its aftermath, perhaps landmines or other ordnance like that. Refugees in Thailand, basically, who were able to join in the set of the movie. Now, if we were going to engage in some extreme nitpicking, we could ask why the crowd is going up this way while the group push the vehicle against the crowd going the other way. The direction of travel, as we can see here, it would have all been going north, and the crowd was going the same way out of the city that the group of journalists would have been going in. So now, it would usually have taken about 5 minutes to just walk to the French embassy from Le Phnom, but given the crowds and given having to push the vehicle, we can presume that it took much longer than that, perhaps maybe half an hour. So we can say that when they arrive at the embassy, that would have been at around 6 p.m. So their day ends here at the embassy. Now, we'll look at how accurate the movie is on those next few days in another video. That's the fall of Phnom Penh. That's the 17th of April 1975 as depicted on film. So what are some of the overall takeaways in terms of visuals or historical accuracy that we can have a bit of a discussion about? Now, I'll just take a second to give a nod to the director, who in the commentary track for the movie, he does mention that, he's not delivering a lecture. He's not making a historical essay. This isn't his intent, and it's not what movies are generally, based on reality or not. They are pieces of art. So in that sense, I'm not going to criticize it within that lens of, I'm not going to criticize it as a piece of art. That being said, the point of this video is just basically to see where this depiction does differ from the reality and what it was based on. So given that, there were some choices made there by the screenwriter and the director that we can look at. For instance, the minor changes to how the morning proceeded, there's really not much there to change our perception of things enough. However, the choices made while the journalists were detained are pretty large departures from the source material. As we said, there were killings going on across the city, and there will be many more. Lon Nol soldiers are being coerced to checkpoints, then led away to be executed, as will the vast majority of those former officials who turn up to the lures of the safety in these Khmer Rouge broadcasts. Now, the issue is that the film is tied to the perspective of the journalists, and none of them witness these murders. They are implied, Later in the embassy scenes, for instance, we have, the implied murder of top officials. But the director made the choice to include graphic depictions of the Khmer Rouge killing people during this detention under the bridge. And that's fair enough, because where else was he going to put that in? And it makes sense. Similarly, having made it as relaxed as an atmosphere as it really was for the majority of the time that they were detained probably would have had an incongruous effect on the watching audience. The decision to cut out of the film entirely what happened after they were detained, as they go to the Ministry of Information, that's interesting as well. And for me, it more presents maybe missed opportunities. We could have seen the more organised upper echelons of the Khmer Rouge at work, in contrast to the depiction of, the illiterate grunts that are shown. Now, I understand that that is representative, but I think having included these, this polite French-speaking Khmer Rouge, the smiling, but also with this sense of menace, I think that would have been a good opportunity to sort of show a different component of the Communist Party of Kampuchea. The people that were instrumental in actually coming up with the murderous and genocidal ideology which will carry the next few years of their revolution. It would have shown sort of the range of backgrounds that had been attracted to this insurgency, attracted to their cause. So moving on to the crowds and the exodus from the city, again, it's an absolute achievement. Brilliant how it turned out. Truly great cinematography. I think made even more so realistic by consulting photographers like Roland Joffe, who was there, as well as the journalists who were there and could give these kinds of insights. It's basically one of the best examples of art meeting history in an attempt to recreate a historical event. And for me personally, it does sit right up there with the likes of, Titanic or Apollo 13. All in all, the depiction of the fall of Phnom Penh, it is highly accurate, and it is pretty close to the source material it's based on. Now, the same cannot be said for what happens next in the French embassy, and in particular, the depiction of Al Rockoff it's basically still got him pissed off about some of the scenes there, and I guess how he is shown overall throughout the movie. Similarly, there are some issues with the depictions of the revolutionary era that we see later in the movie that we will do in a different video as well. Now, if you have any questions about the movie or the history behind it, or if you think I've missed out on something, please let me know in the comments. And if this is your first time watching something on this channel, my name is Lachlan Peters. I'm a long-time student of Cambodian history. I'm the creator of In the Shadows of Utopia podcast, which is a detailed history of Cambodia and the Khmer Rouge. I'm writing my first book on the subject currently, and I'm devoted to giving this history the amount of attention and research that it deserves. So, if that sounds like something you'd be interested in, like and subscribe. I'll see you next time.